Hello, everyone. Welcome to Winthrop in the World. I'm Paul Baskin, and with us today is Stevie Olsen. Stevie is a teacher of English at a preparatory high school in Albuquerque, New Mexico, from the area. Thank you for coming all the way out here, first of all.
Completely my joy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and Stevie, the reason Stevie's here is because he actually spent 6 years in the Boston area at Harvard. You got a master's degree there at the Kennedy School, right? Mm-hmm. Kennedy School of Public Policy. And while there, you got a request, or a group of you got a request from a congressman around here, Seth Moulton. Maybe if you tell people what the request was and what effect it has for people here in Winthrop and in the general area.
Yeah, so Representative Moulton, who's on the represents the North Shore,
right, around Salem.
Was in connection with Professor Linda Bilmez at the Kennedy School, who's an amazing professor, and we had a team that got together, and Congressman Moulton asked us, what's the fully loaded cost of roads?
The fully loaded cost of roads, okay. What does that even mean?
Well, you know, we sort of took the project on and we're like, this is a really simple question. You know, it's something we interact with roads in our society pretty much every day of our lives. And we were thinking, someone had to have answered this question before.
Okay.
So we went into the research, we thought about it, and we found that nobody had really taken on the question in a comprehensive, deep way. There were incredibly thoughtful studies about consumer costs or pollution or different things, but to put it all together to think about what's the cost of the motor vehicle economy was something that drew us towards that question. Uh-huh. I think another part that drove the question is this double standard of infrastructure investment. When we see a price tag related to public transit, whether it be for the T or buses or commuter rail, people sort of have this sticker shock of this one-time cost. It's how many $1 billion? Right. But we spend billions of dollars annually on roads, and we sort of never question it or even think about it.
And yes, and so fully loaded, you mean the overall total cost of everything that society spends on it. And you came up with a figure of $14,000 per family in the state of Massachusetts?
So the big number is Massachusetts annually spends $64 billion every year on the motor vehicle economy. Okay. Approximately $28 million of that are are consumer costs. So if you own a car, you're familiar with buying it and financing it. You're familiar with insurance. You're familiar with fuel costs. You're familiar with maintenance and repairs. So those are all things that consumers bear. And on average, that's about $6,000 a car per year, or $12,000 per household. The average household owns about 2 cars in Massachusetts. But then there's $35 billion related to the Massachusetts economy every year that is publicly borne. So whether you drive or not,
or how much you drive,
you bear that cost.
Right.
And that averages out to about $14,000 per year on average for the Massachusetts household, subsidizing the motor vehicle economy, whether you drive or not, or how much you drive.
Right. So people don't get a bill for $14,000 in the mail every year, right? That comes in some other way. It's probably complicated, but it's the best you can explain. How are we paying $14,000 a family for cars, regardless of whether we're actually using one?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that a lot of us have to have a mind shift on, and I did myself. We access roads for free. Like, we drive out of our driveway, we get on the roads, we drive for free. There's some tolls in Boston that we pick up, but most of the cost of driving is our consumer costs, where we see it coming out of our bank account and we feel it. So these publicly borne costs are diffuse, and it's one of the reasons that the question Congressman Moulton and Professor Bilmez, who led our team, wanted us to answer this is it's not an easy question. So about 16% of those costs, about $2,200, are what we call public budgetary costs.
So 16% of what costs again?
Of the 14,000.
14,000, okay.
Or the 35 billion, depending on which way you're looking at it.
Yeah.
But that is public budgetary costs. So if you go into your local city or town budget, if you go to the state budget, if you go to the federal budget, you can find line items related to road maintenance, road signage, emergency response for road-related issues, infrastructure investment, capital spending, and then a big one is in Boston is the road maintenance backlog. That's a real cost. So if your roads aren't maintained, at some point they're going to have to be fixed, and so that's a cost to all of us. So that's real dollars that are on the public budget, and they can be moved and shifted depending on what the political will is.
So I hear that. So yes, the government spends money on roads, but people will say, drivers will say that, well, yes, but I pay gas tax, I pay excise tax. Aren't those taxes covering these costs?
Yeah, so we looked at kind of what we would call user revenue and sort of the different places of user revenue. And user revenue falls quite short of those public budgetary costs. You know, it's not nearly 100%, it's about 2/3 of it. And of course, we're reminded of the constant debate with public transit where people say, hey, user fees should generate 100% of the operating costs of the transit system, and it usually doesn't. But the same thing is true for roads.
Right. Is there a reason why shouldn't the government pay for roads regardless of whether people drive? Is there any problem with that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. One, it's partially the government paying for it, and the government subsidizes lots of systems. I think we all benefit from roads in lots of ways. It's how emergency responders get to us. It's how our groceries usually get to the grocery store, or at least do the last mile. So we all sort of have some benefit in the infrastructure system, but it doesn't have to be the only infrastructure system, and investing in it also helps the other infrastructure systems work well themselves. And I think it's important to note that it's not just government spending. The second line item on costs is indirect social and economic costs. And so as a society...
So I just want to stop because there's a lot of numbers we're throwing out there, but just to break it down into categories, there's an amount of money for cars that you pay for as a user. There's an amount that the town or the city, the state pays for out of its budget, and then there's a whole other category that you're trying to get into, which is costs that people feel but they don't really pay in the sense of writing a check for it or something like that.
Yeah, there's no like one place that you're sending this check, but you know, one of the big costs related to the motor vehicle economy is injuries and deaths. And so you might lose a family member, you might lose a coworker, you might lose a community member. They might need significant support after an accident or something related to the motor vehicle economy, and that's a real cost society bears, either by having to support that person and help the situation, or losing the productivity and engagement of a person and the training that we've put into someone. So that's a real cost that we all bear. That might show up in your like health insurance. You know, it's a small fraction of it, but it's those premiums going up year after year. Similarly, we all face congestion. So there's traffic. If anybody's ever gotten on a Boston road, they're very familiar with traffic.
Well, it's funny you mention that because I mean, I want to keep going a list, but on that one, there's a debate going on in town. I know you're back in New Mexico mostly, but about bike lanes and the mayor. And in other places, well, Winthrop doesn't have any, first of all, but in Boston, where they have them, the mayor's talking about cutting them back because people are saying that the roads are too congested, so the bike lanes are in the way. Is that a logical response to the road congestion?
I don't think so. I mean, I think a lot of studies show the more lanes you have,
the more car lanes you have.
The more car lanes you have, the more congestion fills those lanes really quick. And that's not really what causes congestion. There's a lot of interesting studies on traffic. It's one of the areas of our study that has been studied deeply. And a lot of people talk about, and this is a Northeast reference, the hockey stick of traffic. You know, as long as there's so many cars on the road, it's going really, really smooth. But when you hit this pivotal point,
Right.
traffic and time lost in traffic goes way up. Right. And putting an extra lane doesn't necessarily mitigate that loss significantly. Logically, it seems like if you have 25% more road, you could have 25% more cars,
Right.
but that's just not the way our traffic infrastructure works.
Right, right. It's what's called induced demand.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. But then people sitting there in a car looking at a bike lane that they say is empty, get upset with that.
Yeah.
Is there a logical basis to that being upset?
You know, I mean, it makes sense in the moment. You know, most of the roads are empty the 24 hours of the day, and
Right.
so like, you know, that's one of the other major costs is land use.
Right.
Billions of dollars across Massachusetts are dedicated to roads and parking,
Right.
and the majority of the day, those roads and parking sit empty. Right. You know, there's multiple places for you to park your car around Massachusetts, but your car's only in one place.
Right, right.
You know, if you take a 10-mile commute to work, the lane is, you know, probably on average about 10 feet wide, right. And you cruise through it for 10 miles, and you're not thinking about sort of that sunk cost. Right. I drive through some of the beautiful towns and cities in the Boston area, or just generally in Massachusetts, and all of the city centers are cut up by roads. Right. There's not really a safe way to walk across the road with a kid, or if you're elderly. And so roads have just become ubiquitous and are everywhere, and we as a society can intentionally decide to do something different with them if we want.
Right. So you were going through the list of sort of costs that you don't pay out as a check, to sort of use that metaphor. There are some others too. I mean, you mentioned health. You mentioned injuries from cars. What about just general health from? I mean, I guess asthma's a big issue. Military budgets. I think you were listing. Maybe.
I mean, I think pollution and greenhouse gases are a real part of the motor vehicle economy that we bear, and so there's a lot of people that live near excessively heavily used roads, and this is one of those inequities that pop up in the motor vehicle economy. The people that live near the road are bearing the majority of that pollution costs, oftentimes through asthma and things like that.
And noise too.
And noise, absolutely.
Right, yeah.
And other people are able to kind of get away from those major roadways and don't have to bear them in the same way.
Right.
You know, I think about a community like Winthrop and thinking about sort of the effects of the climate and how is it going to mitigate that.
Right.
Those are real costs that communities are going to have to bear in infrastructure and lost economic revenue.
Right.
You look at the fires in California and seeing insurance companies backing out of mortgages and things like that. I mean, these are dominoes that are complicated, and we, again, have some power to think about these things and approach them in different ways.
Right. I mean, I know you're not an expert on Winthrop town government or politics, but that is the case here too as well. There's a lot of upcoming money that needs to be spent on helping out communities in town that are facing rising flooding already.
Yeah.
There's also, I mean, there's also votes coming up on school. The school system is running out of money, so it needs money. The fire department needs a new station. There's other costs coming up. Is this the kind of thing where you could look at that and say, oh, maybe this is the money we could somehow recover? I mean, or is that kind of money that's sort of more built into our society in ways that the town couldn't just pull it out and get that money?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's interesting. One is you're kind of talking about the sunk cost of money that's already in roads,
right.
And how do you extract that? You know, you can have gradual planning to how do we have less roads to take care of. You know, a lot of times in Boston, I hear people complain about like the snow plowing's not happening fast enough, or how did we not deal with the 8 feet of snow in a reasonable amount of time? Right. You know, and so like you kind of pay for what you get. You can also raise revenue in different ways. Right. So, you know, most of the parking in our country is free.
Yeah. In Boston, it's if you live in Boston, you can park for free.
Yeah.
You get it free. In Winthrop, it's $5 for an entire year.
Yeah. And I mean, that might cover some of the administrative costs, but it doesn't actually cover the land use costs. It doesn't cover the cost of maintaining the roads. It doesn't cover the plowing cost of you having this parking spot.
Right.
And so, is that these are big questions for policymakers. Are these things you want to charge to the user? Are there other ways to raise revenue to help cover some of those costs?
Right. But the problem is, you talk to people in town and they've already bought their car, so they want to keep it, and in any kind of talk of raising prices like that, they feel, maybe rightfully, that would be more of an expense on them. Are they right to think of it that way, or is there some way in which that would, in the long run, actually be better for them to have a sort of a less car-centric place, not have to pay for a car necessarily if they didn't want to, and maybe save money that way? I mean, does it somehow work out that in the long run they would be better off, even though it might feel like pain now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a complicated question, and I mean, I'm not here to say what's ethical or anything like that, but I do think that if we really bared these costs more directly, it would change our behavior. If I pay $6,000 for my car, but then I have to pay another $14,000 for my household to be owning and operating, all of a sudden I'm going to be looking for other means and methods. I'm going to be much more interested in saying, hey, make buses efficient, give me a commuter rail stop, give me bike lanes so I can ride my bike when the weather's good. And it absolutely is a long game here. Right. What do you want your community to look like? What do you want your public health to look like? If we built walkable communities, if we built bikeable communities, people are going to be outside more, they're going to be connecting with people more, they're going to be more excited to live in these places. And so, again, it goes back to the really important word, which is trade-offs. These are trade-offs. And right now, most of the country operates in the way that roads are permanent, they've always been here, they're always going to be here, and there's no way to sort of trade off to other things. And our study by no means advocates that you should get rid of every road and you should get rid of every car. We're just challenging the double standard that we are entitled to roads, that they're free, and all of the costs are just kind of things we have to go along with.
Right, and also I guess when you came in here, you went through Everett maybe, and
yeah.
So you saw kind of what it looks like to have a very car-centric pathway, even if this town doesn't feel particularly onerous in that regard, because it's pretty easy to get around within this town. Mm-hmm. But this getting in and out of this town is quite difficult.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I think that's the commute, right?
Yeah.
But also, I just think about how beautiful Winthrop is, and wanting to, I would come here and ride my bike around, the area if I felt safe, right? By Concord, there's the rail trail, and you're off the road, mm-hmm. you can ride. I love cities that shut down parts of their roads in business centers for part of the time, so you can walk from a coffee shop to a bookstore to a restaurant. These are economic development things that I think during COVID there was some chances to think about the world differently because people were behaving differently. But after COVID has kind of broke and we've gone back to normal, we didn't create a new normal that was different in lifestyle, especially related to the car. Right. We went back to our normal commute, parking, road-centric infrastructure.
Which brings up there's all kinds of debates that are fought with statistics over this, and then they're also fought, it seems like, with emotion.
Yeah.
But on the issue about sort of less cars in downtowns, that's also a big issue in New York City, of course. Mm-hmm. They're talking about it in Boston more. There's different studies, are there, that show whether businesses do better in that kind of environment or don't. Do you know I guess it's not something you've studied personally, or have you maybe, but do you know what sort of is the bottom line sort of consensus on that question?
I don't know if I know what the bottom line consensus is. I think a lot of people are comfortable with the status quo. And so whenever there's a proposal, people are worried about the disruption of construction. Right. What does this mean for our business? What does this look like? But I think in general, there's lots of case studies to go look at when those areas are put together well and places become more walkable, there's more trees, there's more outdoor areas, things like that, that there's a lot of revenue generated. It becomes a magnet. You know, and one of the games in economics for communities is how do you keep revenue in here, in a community, rather than people going to spend it elsewhere, and how do you get external revenue to come inside? And I think one of the answers is you do things differently than your peers. You make your community more attractive, more walkable, more recreational friendly. You make it a place you want to live. You know, and there's lots of questions like, would you rather go to a coffee shop with 3 parking spots in the front of it, or would you rather go to a coffee shop with, you know, 3 giant trees and 9 tables outside? You know, and I have my answer.
Right. So Winthrop, again, speaking of Winthrop, I don't know if you know, but Winthrop used to have, I mean, this is for maybe old timers would know this because we're talking like, I think in the 50s maybe, or 60s, I'm not sure when it ended, but there used to be a network of rail throughout Winthrop. You can still see remnants of it when you go around town. Near the beach, there's a sort of an old track segment that exists, and it goes into what used to be, I guess, a tunnel, but that's been covered in. So, but anyway, the point is that Winthrop used to have a robust network of rail lines. I guess 1, was it a mistake to have given that up? And 2, is there any chance that kind of thing could be brought back, or is that just too difficult, like just not realistic to think of in any town nowadays because of what it would involve in terms of the construction, in terms of the disruption and all that kind of stuff?
You know, one of the important questions that I think any community or policymaker answers is, what are we trying to do here? Like, what is the goal? What is the objective? And if the goal is to, you know, create an equitable transport for people, if the goal is to, you know, help people commute to work efficiently, if the goal is to create economic development by attracting people, you know, those are much different goals than just being like, you know, we want our roads to be smooth and we want places to park. I think a lot of communities lament the lack of investment in public infrastructure or the ripping up of former infrastructure, you know, because the people that built those, you know, saw sort of ideas of how to get people places efficiently, effectively. And so, you know, we have to reconsider. I think a lot about building codes. And whenever you try to construct something, there's always codes that guide on parking. You have to have so much parking outside of, you know, the building, depending on its occupancy, depending on its purpose, you know, whatever. But what if building codes had other parts of it? You don't have to get rid of the car parts of it, but they had, you know, things about walking. They had things about bikes. Every time you're, you know, resurfacing a road, you're building in places for people to interact with that space in other ways just besides motor vehicles. And you know, one of the other challenges for the Boston area and Massachusetts in general is there's so many towns and communities that a lot of these projects have to be coordinated for sort of work on the outside. One thing that's cool about Winthrop is it kind of sits on its own, and it can really do something for its own area, and then think about how to plug that into some greater planning transit.
Right. Again, with us today is Stevie Olsen, a former researcher at Harvard University, worked on a study there that calculated roughly the amount of subsidization that people in Massachusetts give to the car economy, even whether or not they drive. You're just actually getting into the things I want to ask you about, which is how to coordinate that among other towns. I mean, even if Winthrop were to suddenly shift directions on that, decide that they can't afford anymore to keep paying for roads without the revenue to cover it, do these other kinds of things, could they do that on their own, or would that is it the kind of thing that really has to be done in coordination with a much bigger community, either the whole state or the region of the country or anything like that?
I think that, you know, the answer is both. You know, you can do a lot of things locally and individually, and you can, and you also need to coordinate at a larger level. And so, one thing that's cool about local control and sort of devolved access at a you know, a level of the town or city is you can constantly be making decisions about what are you going to do here on these roads? What resources are you going to put in the public works department? What do you want your schools to look like, right? These are all things that occur at the local level. Right. And then of course there's, state level things like Chapter 90 is the big payout at the state level for roads. If you want to change that financing mechanism and what it can be used for, you're likely going to have to get a coalition of cities and towns to go to their state representatives and state senators and say, hey, we want to rewrite this so it has different purposes. Right. And similarly, the goal of government, in my opinion, is to serve the people that, it is for and by. Right. And, so government should have the interest of the people to generate value in commuting and transit. It's a huge part of our lives. It's, an economic engine. And, there's trade-offs. Winthrop might not get everything at once. Everett might not get everything at once. But sometimes we get in these just adversarial fights, fighting over scraps, as opposed to actually seeing the value of something greater that we could build together.
Yeah. So I've had on this program, in fact, members of the town council here, and have talked about this issue a little bit. And what some of them will say is that they don't disagree with this sort of general vision that you're sketching out, but they think that they would simply just get unelected if they did something like that. If they like, again, $5 to park all year long on the public road, if they raise that to anything near the actual value of that land, they think they would just be kicked out. I mean, that's a simple example, but others, even while they're acknowledging that the budget numbers just aren't adding up for the town in a lot of ways, and especially that's going to get worse as sea levels rise and you have to eventually build berms almost around the entire town. What do you say to somebody like that? Isn't that an accurate thing for a town council member in town to say, well, fine, that what Stevie and the Harvard research says looks right, but we couldn't do that because we would just get kicked out.
Yeah, I mean, elected officials have a really tough job, and they're on short contracts, 2-year, 4-year, 6-year terms. And, one of their jobs is to get elected again, and that's part of our check and balance on public officials serving us. In relation to that, public infrastructure is a long-term investment. Right. I mean, proposing something and getting construction started can overrun your term. And you're out of office before anything that you said is going to happen happens. And so that's a really tough trade-off we face as a society. I think, what the public needs, and, humans and the public aren't stupid. They just need people to present visions to them and talk to them about things. And it's really hard to connect the dots on the motor vehicle economy. I've studied it and talked about it for years at this point, and I'm still learning about it and still getting my biases in check about it. But it's connecting the dots between taxes, underfunded infrastructure, lifestyle, what works for me, what I want. And as you start putting sort of these puzzle pieces together, you can kind of imagine the possibilities and realize what's going on. So I think that it really, public officials, can propose things and they can lead, but the public and the community also has to commit to that vision and say, hey, 10 years ago we discussed that we're going to put in 50 miles of bike lane in our communities, and we're at 30 miles, but we're going to keep going, or we had to stop because there was a budget, shortfall for these 2 years, but it's one of the things we're going to put right back in. Right. And so these, those public officials do have, legitimate concerns about their electability and what people want, but there's no way to take on any of this without communal and social values matching up with a vision.
Well, and how do you get that then? Because I mean, even in Boston, which they're seeing the mayor, it's becoming actually an issue in that totally. Mayor election. I mean, she's genuinely concerned. She's that's why she's retreating on some of these things. And here in town, we are actually due to get our first bike lane. Yeah. But it's only a half a mile or so. Yeah. Doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. And it seems like it's already getting opposition because people are looking at it and saying, probably correctly, that a lot of people won't use it because it's only a half mile, doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. I mean, so how do you build that? How do you build that sort of image, vision around a community?
You're running into, one of the big reasons that we wrote this paper is that we were really interested in talking about that double standard. And since our paper's sort of been recreated, there's a really interesting one that was done in Hawaii and things like that. But, they did the paper just to have this conversation, because moving the conversation forward is, really a push and a nudge. One thing that's I think is really important in living in New Mexico and working in public policy there is we're always looking externally. Who's doing stuff better than us? Right. And we're pulling those ideas in. We don't need to reinvent the wheel or just but like, what is, the best bike lane? Is it cars parked next to the curb, then a bike lane, then the road? Or is it the road, cars parked, and then the bike lane's kind of in between the parked cars and the sidewalk? For a bicyclist, that's much safer to be in that location. But, so you have to do research, you have to think about things, you have to do it right, you have to do it well, and then you have to promote it. You have to, be there. Like, nobody's going to want a walkable city center until they've been there. They've, taken their cup of coffee and walked around a road that they're used to driving on, but now they're seeing their friends, their family out and about, walking about. So, humans, we anchor. We're sometimes a little bit slow to evolve, but I think, inviting people to be a part of the change and also participate in the conversation is incredibly important. And it's just going to take some time, and it's going to take some lumps, and people are going to make mistakes. But we're taking those lumps all the time with the motor vehicle economy, and we're taking all the costs of it are problems that we're incurring daily in our lives and not even thinking about.
Well, Stevie Olsen, thank you. Again, researcher at Harvard University a few years ago. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Totally my pleasure.